He thought he was just a broken veteran driving a taxi through another cold morning, until one passenger changed everything. A single act of kindness, given when he had nothing left, unlocked a miracle he never saw coming. What happened next would test his faith, heal old wounds, and reveal a purpose God had been shaping in silence. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. A pale winter dawn lingered over Denver's empty streets as the first taxi dispatch call broke the silence. Michael Carter had already been awake for 15 minutes, though the alarm had not rung. He rarely slept past 4 anymore. Sleep, for him, was a wall made of thin glass. Any sound, any shift in the wind, any echo of the past could shatter it. He sat on the edge of his small apartment's bed, steadying his breath, while Ranger, ever watchful, lifted his head as if sensing the tremor in him before he even acknowledged it himself. Another morning, another effort to assemble the pieces of himself into someone that the world could tolerate. He stood and gathered his winter jacket, the warm layers, the familiar worn cap that once meant belonging to something larger than himself. Now it was only a reminder, a silent insignia of a life that no longer fit him. He tried not to linger on that thought. Ranger trotted to the door, pausing only to ensure Michael followed, as though the dog were the one keeping the man on schedule, not the other way around. Outside, the air was sharp and metallic. He unlocked his taxi, slid into the driver's seat, and let Ranger settle beside him. When he turned the ignition, the heater coughed reluctantly to life. A normal man might have felt annoyance at the machine, but Michael felt comfort. Imperfect things made sense to him. They mirrored him. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Unit 72, possible priority pickup, woman with child stranded near Colfax and Rockmont. No other cars available. Do you copy? He swallowed. That area, at this hour, in this cold, any driver would hesitate. Even on his best days, Michael's pulse quickened at unexpected requests. PTSD didn't show itself in dramatic fits, not for him. It seeped quietly into the edges of his decisions, whispering danger where none should be. But helping people, being useful, was the last piece of himself he still understood. He pressed the receiver. Unit 72, I'll take it. Ranger, as if approving, tapped his paw lightly on the console. Michael allowed himself a small exhale. The city passed slowly outside the window, shuttered storefronts, traffic lights blinking yellow to no one, the lingering hush before Denver awakened. With each turn of the steering wheel, memories tugged at him. Roads in foreign countries, missions ending in silence too heavy to name, comrades who did not come home. He blinked twice, grounding himself. Ranger leaned closer, anchoring him to the present. The dog had become his compass, steady, unwavering, the one living thing that could sense the tremors before they fully rose inside him. When he reached the location, he saw her immediately. A young woman, no more than her late 20s, stood on the far side of a dim parking lot, clutching a bundled child who cried weakly against her shoulder. Her car, hazard lights blinking, was half buried in frost. She looked not frightened, but exhausted, like someone who had fought too many battles in too short a time and had nothing left for this one. Michael pulled up slowly, lowering the window. You call for a taxi? Her relief came in a gasp. Yes. My car died. My daughter has a fever. I need to get to the hospital. He unlocked the back door. Get in. It's warm. As she settled the child into the back seat, Ranger twisted slightly in his place, not hostile, not intrusive, merely alert. The dog's instincts sharpened whenever Michael's heartbeat changed. And it had changed now, though Michael didn't know why. Maybe it was the crying child. Maybe the image of a young mother alone in the cold. Maybe the memory of how helplessness had once felt, like a weight on his own chest. As he drove, the woman tried to apologize repeatedly, each word cracking under the strain of fear and fatigue. "I'm sorry, I know it's early. I know it's far. I don't even know if I have enough cash on me." "It doesn't matter right now," Michael said, more firmly than he intended. "We'll get your daughter taken care of first." His tone startled her into silence. Ranger glanced at him as if checking whether he was still steady. Michael softened his voice. "What's her name?" "Lucy," she whispered. "She's been sick all night, and the roads are so icy, and—" Michael raised a hand gently. "You're safe now." He wasn't sure why those words came so easily. Maybe because he had wanted someone to say them to him once. Maybe because in that fragile moment, seeing a mother fighting her own quiet war, he remembered the part of himself that had always moved toward the suffering of others, not away from it. At the hospital entrance, he helped her out, carried the child's small bag, and waited until a nurse rushed to them. When the woman turned back, fumbling for her purse, Michael shook his head quickly. "No charge," he said. Tears welled immediately, but she nodded instead of arguing. Gratitude sometimes was heavier than debt. As she disappeared through the sliding doors, Michael leaned against the side of his taxi, letting the cold sting his skin. Ranger nudged his knee, urging him back inside, as though reminding him that staying too long in his own thoughts was dangerous territory. On the drive back toward the city, his stomach twisted. He had not eaten since yesterday afternoon, and the ration he bought earlier was for Ranger. Yet, even now, the idea of eating felt distant, like a luxury belonging to another life. He replayed the woman's expression, her child's faint cry. Was it foolish to refuse payment when he needed every dollar? Maybe. But Michael had lived through moments where money meant nothing and human decency meant survival, and some part of him, perhaps the part that Ranger guarded most fiercely, refused to let that part die. Before he could settle back into routine, the dispatch crackled again. "Unit 72. Status check? We have another unusual request if you're available." Michael exhaled deeply. His hands tightened around the wheel. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift. The way past and present collided inside Michael, pushing and pulling him like two opposing tides. He pressed the button. "Send the details." He didn't know it yet, but this choice, this willingness to keep going despite hunger, fatigue, and ghosts of the past, was the first step into a story far larger than his own tired life behind the wheel. The city settled into a cold mid-morning as Michael guided the taxi back toward downtown, the steering wheel trembling faintly as though echoing the unrest in his hands. Hunger had become a slow, persistent pressure in his stomach, and the kind that carved inward rather than outward. He had grown used to ignoring it, but today it felt sharper, perhaps because the small warmth he gained from helping the young mother vanished too quickly into the biting air. Ranger sensed it before Michael admitted it to himself. The dog shifted closer, not with concern, but with a steadying instinct, as if reminding him that the world had not tipped completely off its axis. Michael kept driving. The radio buzzed intermittently, dispatch voices rising and falling with the rhythm of a workday that did not care if he was tired or hungry or haunted. There was a comfort in that indifference. Predictable systems were easier than unpredictable memories. He stopped briefly near a convenience store, reaching into his pocket for the last crumpled bills he had left. It was barely enough for a small packet of food for Ranger, nothing more. The cashier, a young man barely older than Michael's memories of training days, rang up the purchase without looking twice at him. That indifference, too, felt like a balm. Back in the taxi, he tore open the packet for Ranger. The dog waited until Michael nodded before eating, as if it understood the unspoken hierarchy of need. Watching him, Michael felt a blend of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that Ranger could still find trust in the world, guilt that he could not feed himself the same way. He drank water slowly, hoping the cold liquid would quiet the ache in his stomach. Driving again, he tried to push aside thoughts that rose uninvited. The young mother's exhausted eyes. The faint cry of Lucy, the cold echo of a memory from years ago when he'd carried a wounded teammate through a sandstorm, his own stomach empty for 2 days, running on instinct and fear and the last ember of duty. Silence filled the taxi until dispatch spoke again, softer than before, as if the operator sensed the fragile balance inside him. Unit 72, unusual request pending. Elderly couple stranded near the old mall. He accepted before his brain had time to protest. Helping them would keep his mind from looping into darker corners. Ranger's ears tipped slightly, not in warning, but in awareness, as though the dog understood this new task carried a weight different from the last one. When they reached the old mall, the world felt quieter than it should have been. The structure loomed in a half-forgotten state, a relic of busier decades now surrounded by empty lots and shuttered storefronts. In that open quiet, Michael spotted the couple standing by a dark-colored sedan. The man held himself in a way that suggested he wished to appear calm despite the situation. The woman clutched a folder, the edges pressed tightly against her chest. Their movements lacked panic, but carried a fatigue that resonated deeply with Michael. He stepped out of the taxi slowly, speaking in a tone meant to anchor rather than startle. "Need help?" The man nodded with a measured politeness, explaining that their car would not start, that their phone had died, that they needed a ride but currently found themselves without a way to pay. Michael felt the familiar twist inside him, a tight line strung between logic and instinct. Logic told him he needed money. Instinct told him he could not leave 2 elderly strangers standing alone in this cold. Ranger, still inside the taxi, watched without a sound. His stillness was its own message. Michael gestured them into the vehicle. Once they were seated, he adjusted the heater and asked where they needed to go. They offered directions, quietly grateful, though the woman's hands trembled slightly around her folder. As he drove, Michael listened to the cadence of their voices more than their words. They spoke carefully, almost formally, as if unused to asking for help. Something about their tone reminded him of old commanding officers, people trained to mask uncertainty. The memory pressed on him in ways he did not welcome. His thoughts began to scatter like loose papers in wind. He tried to breathe steadily, grounding himself with small, tactile anchors. The firm grip of the steering wheel, Ranger's calm presence, the rhythmic hum of the engine. Yet beneath all of it, the hunger sharpened. Not only the hunger in his stomach, but a deeper one, the hunger for clarity, for purpose, for something more solid than drifting from fare to fare, day to day. The couple noticed his silence but said nothing. When he pulled up near their hotel, the man turned to him with quiet resignation and repeated that they could not pay him today. Michael did not hesitate. He waved it off, even though part of him recoiled at the thought of another unpaid ride. "Take care of yourselves," he said. The woman's eyes softened with something resembling relief, but also something more complicated. He didn't analyze it. He didn't have the energy. He watched them walk toward the hotel entrance, the man steadying the woman as the wind lifted at their coats. Only once they vanished inside did he feel the strange stir in his chest, a sense that the moment had been larger than it appeared. Ranger nudged him again, this time with a firmer insistence. Michael knew what it meant. He had lingered too long in his thoughts. He started the engine, telling himself to focus on the next task, because focusing on anything else meant stepping into the minefield of memory. Before he could merge back into traffic, the dispatch system lit up for the 3rd time that morning. Unit 72, please confirm availability. There is a request flagged specifically for you. Michael stared at the glowing text longer than he meant to. Ranger shifted, sensing the tension rising in him like a tide. He pressed the button to respond, trying to steady his voice. "Go ahead." The reply came at once, more precise than any he had received in months. "A representative wishes to speak with you directly. Are you able to take a call?" Michael hesitated, heartbeat uneven, as though some part of his life had just reached forward to catch up with him. Then he answered. "Send it through." A thin veil of winter light filled the car as the call transferred through the taxi's worn speakers, carrying with it a tone that did not belong on a morning like this. Michael felt the tension ripple beneath his ribs even before the voice spoke. The representative introduced herself with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to speaking to strangers who matter. She asked if he could come to an address in downtown Denver for a brief conversation regarding a community initiative. Her choice of words was precise, layered in a way that made him uneasy. People who spoke that smoothly rarely needed something simple. Michael's first impulse was to decline. He had been summoned before in life, often to places that demanded pieces of him he never got back. The thought alone made the edges of his breath feel sharp. Ranger sensed the change instantly, raising his head and watching him as if preparing to intervene against whatever memory was constructing itself behind his eyes. The representative continued, assuring him that the meeting would be short, that no commitment was required, that his presence alone was requested due to his reputation for reliability. That phrase struck him harder than he expected. In the past, reliability meant following orders, completing missions, pushing through pain because someone else's life depended on it. Now it meant showing up for strangers in the city when most people were still asleep. He did not know which version of himself she referred to, but both exhausted him. Still, he found himself agreeing. Maybe curiosity was a form of recklessness. Maybe hunger clouded his judgment. Or maybe some quiet part of him wanted to believe he still had value beyond the steering wheel and the dark corners of his own mind. As he drove toward the address, the city shifted into late-morning activity. Commuters filled the sidewalks. Delivery trucks blocked narrow streets. The world moved as though unaware of the internal storms carried by the people within it. Michael kept his focus sharp, but beneath the surface, his thoughts churned. Why him? What had he done that would attract attention from an organization that could afford a spokesperson with that kind of tone, dispatch rarely forwarded private requests for drivers? Something about this felt intentional, directed. That unease stayed with him all the way to the tall glass building that rose above the surrounding blocks like a sentinel watching the city breathe. He parked near the front entrance, studying its polished facade. The height made him feel small in a way he didn't like. It reminded him of the moment before stepping into a briefing room where lives would hinge on decisions made in minutes. Ranger nudged his hand, grounding him. The dog's presence created a small sphere of steadiness around him, a reminder that he was no longer walking into danger for a chain of command. He stepped out and followed a security officer who had been waiting just inside the door. The officer introduced himself quietly and led him through a lobby where everything echoed lightly, as if the building were designed to magnify a person's awareness of themselves. In the elevator, the soft hum of ascending floors triggered an old reflex in him. Elevators had once meant containment, limited routes of escape, narrow paths to vulnerability. He inhaled slowly, controlling the rising pressure in his chest. Ranger remained at his side, silent, a presence that anchored him to the present instead of dropping him into the past. When the elevator doors opened, he found himself in a conference room with wide windows and minimal furnishings. Two people waited inside. One was an assistant, carrying a small digital tablet, taking notes without speaking more than a greeting. The other introduced himself simply as a program coordinator for a large community foundation. His tone was polite, but there was weight behind his words. He said they had taken notice of Michael's work ethic, of how often he accepted difficult calls, of how he treated people. He mentioned, almost casually, that they'd received word of his early morning assistance to the mother and her sick child. Michael felt heat rise beneath his collar. He did not like being observed. He did not like the idea that his actions meant only for the moment and the people involved, had been cataloged somewhere. The coordinator assured him that their interest was positive, that they were building a network of individuals who demonstrated resilience, compassion, and reliability in real-world environments. He said the foundation had an upcoming initiative involving community outreach, veteran support, and development planning, and they were looking for people shaped by lived experience rather than credentials alone. Hearing the word veteran caused a faint tremor in his chest. That label followed him everywhere, even when he tried to bury it beneath layers of routine. The coordinator asked about his background in terms that were gentle but probing. Michael answered only what he had to. He mentioned his service without describing the weight of it. He mentioned PTSD only when necessary, not as an explanation, but as a fact he had learned to navigate like bad weather. Ranger remained vigilant, responding to every shift in Michael's breathing with quiet awareness. The coordinator noticed, acknowledging the dog's role with a respectful nod. Then came the part that unsettled him most. The coordinator explained that the foundation believed certain individuals carried a unique ability to uplift struggling communities, not through speeches or grand gestures, but through the quiet, consistent choice to act with integrity even when no one was watching. It was said in a general sense, but the implication pressed directly against the core of Michael's identity. Integrity had once come easily, shaped by training and purpose. Now it felt like something he pieced together on days when he had just enough strength to get out of bed. The coordinator handed him a card and said their director wanted to meet him personally at a later date. They emphasized that today's meeting was simply to gauge interest. But Michael sensed something more beneath the surface, something not yet spoken. As he left the room, the assistant gave him a brief nod that carried a hint of recognition, as though they knew more about him than he had offered. That unsettled him further. Back in the taxi, Michael let the silence settle. Ranger watched him carefully, sensing the conflicting currents inside him. He started the engine, trying to tell himself that it was only a meeting, nothing more. Yet, as he pulled away from the curb, he noticed a small envelope tucked beneath his windshield wiper that had not been there before. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the parking lot as Michael stood by the taxi, the envelope in his hand, feeling heavier than it looked. The paper itself was light, but the unknown sealed inside pressed against every nerve that had spent years bracing for bad news. Ranger watched him from the front seat, eyes steady, sensing the familiar hesitation that always came when Michael stood between staying where he was and stepping into something uncertain. He slid into the driver's seat, held the envelope a moment longer, then tore it open with the practiced motion of someone who had opened far too many mission orders in another lifetime. The letterhead at the top bore the name of the foundation he had just visited. The wording was formal, yet strangely personal, thanking him for taking the time to meet and inviting him back the next day for a more detailed conversation with their director and senior team regarding a potential long-term collaboration in community work and veteran support. There was a line that caught his eye and would not let go. "We believe your lived experience and demonstrated character align with a project of significant scale in this city." Demonstrated character. The phrase twisted inside him. They were turning his private choices into evidence. He was not sure whether to feel honored or exposed. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head lightly against Michael's arm, a quiet reminder that whatever waited in those polished rooms, the core of who he was had been forged long before any foundation noticed him. That night, sleep came in fragments. When he closed his eyes, memories collided. The face of the young mother, the quiet voices of the elderly couple in the back seat, the sterile brightness of the conference room, the feeling of crossing thresholds without knowing what they would demand. At one point he woke to his own pulse racing, the ceiling above him blurred by the remnants of a dream in which he was walking again through sand and smoke instead of snow and city streets. Ranger lay close, awake, steady as a sentry. Michael counted his breaths until the room settled back into focus. By morning, he felt hollow and wired at the same time. Hunger was there too, persistent, but now overshadowed by a different kind of tension. He put on his familiar layers, each piece of clothing an anchor to routine, and drove back toward the glass building that seemed to grow taller every time he looked up at it. Inside the lobby, the same quiet echo greeted him. The security procedures were smoother this time, as if he had already been added to an invisible list. In the elevator, he felt again that old instinct to measure exits, to imagine worst-case scenarios, to prepare for questions he did not want to answer. Ranger's presence kept those instincts from running unchecked, pulling his mind back each time it tried to spiral into familiar darkness. The conference room was different today, larger, with a long table and a window that framed the city in a way that made Denver look almost gentle. 3 people were there when he entered. The program coordinator from yesterday, a woman who introduced herself as part of the Foundation's leadership team, and a man whose calm bearing suggested he was accustomed to making decisions that changed the direction of entire projects with a single sentence. They invited him to sit. There were brief formalities, but they did not linger on them. The man at the head of the table began speaking about the city itself, about neighborhoods that had been overlooked for years, about communities where veterans and their families struggled with limited access to mental health care, job training, and stable support. As he spoke, Michael felt a strange tension forming inside him. This was the world he drove through every day, only now described in graphs and reports instead of faces and addresses. The leadership woman unfolded a large set of plans on the table. The lines and markings were unfamiliar to him, but the intention was clear. A facility. A place built for people like those he had been quietly helping in small ways from behind the wheel of his taxi. She explained that the Foundation had been evaluating potential sites for a comprehensive community and veteran support center, and the abandoned mall where he had picked up the elderly couple was one of those sites. That detail struck him with a jolt. The old mall was embedded in his mental map of the city as a place people avoided or passed by without seeing. The idea that it could be transformed into something else felt almost unreal, like picturing a scar turning into a doorway. They asked him what he had seen in that area, not as a consultant, but as someone who drove its streets and watched its corners. He answered slowly, speaking of people, not statistics. Of the cabs he had driven through there at night, the veterans he suspected were sleeping in cars, the families he dropped off at overfull shelters, the small patterns of survival he had witnessed from his side of the glass. They listened. Really listened. It unsettled him. Usually when he spoke of such things, the responses were sympathetic but practical, or brushed aside with phrases about limited budgets and personal responsibility. Here, each detail seemed to land on the table as another piece in a puzzle they were actively trying to solve. Then they shifted from questions to something else. The man at the head of the table explained that the Foundation did not want to simply build a center and leave it to be managed by people disconnected from the community. They believed such projects needed leaders who understood both the cost of struggle and the worth of small acts of dignity. Leaders shaped by hardship rather than by comfortable theories. When he said this, his gaze rested on Michael with a clarity that made the room feel smaller. The woman beside him spoke next, laying out a proposal in measured, careful language. The Foundation was prepared to fund a full scholarship for Michael to study fields related to nonprofit management and mental health support, to work alongside experienced teams in existing centers, and eventually to return and help lead the development and operation of a new center on Denver's neglected ground. At first, the words barely made sense. Scholarship, training, leadership. They felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had not woken up drenched in sweat, who did not measure exits in every room, who did not rely on a service dog to keep his mind from breaking open at random. He tried to speak but stopped, his throat unexpectedly tight. Ranger shifted subtly, picking up the surge of emotion and nudging him back toward steady breathing. Doubts flooded in. What if he failed? What if the weight of responsibility broke him in ways the battlefield never could? What if he accepted, thinking he could make a difference, and instead became one more man who had disappointed the people who counted on him? Michael said as much, though his voice remained low. He spoke about his PTSD bluntly, not to gain sympathy, but to make clear that whatever they imagined he could be, they needed to factor in the fractures that still existed beneath his functioning surface. The room grew quiet. The Foundation's director did not look away, did not flinch. He acknowledged the reality of trauma's lingering presence and said they did not see it as disqualifying, but as part of what made his perspective valuable. The goal, he said, was not to build a center run by flawless people, but by honest ones who understood what it meant to walk through darkness and still choose to serve others. That phrase settled somewhere deep in Michael's chest. Still choose to serve. It was, in some ways, the only thread that had remained intact after everything else tore. They did not demand an immediate answer. Instead, they handed him a folder containing the proposal in writing, the projected plans for the center, the potential timeline. They suggested he take time to consider, to discuss with people he trusted. People he trusted. The list was short. On the ride home, that fact weighed on him. Back in his apartment, he placed the folder on the table and stared at it as if it were some unfamiliar device that might explode or open into a new horizon. Ranger sat nearby, calm and patient, clearly sensing that this new file was different from the usual things Michael brought home. After a long stretch of silence, Michael opened the folder and began to read. Each page pulled him further into a vision of a place he could almost see, a place where the faces he drove past at night might walk in and find more than a ride to the next temporary shelter. His hand paused on the page that carried a provisional title near the top, a name that made the room tilt for a moment. Tentative facility name, Michael Carter Community and Veteran Support Center. He read the line twice, pulse pounding. Against his ears, while Ranger lifted his head sharply, as if sensing that some unseen line in Michael's life had just been crossed. Winter sunlight drifted softly across the renovated lot as Michael stood before the structure that had once been a decaying mall and was now transformed into a place shaped by quiet purpose. Weeks had passed since he first read his name printed on the proposal, weeks filled with decisions that pressed against old wounds and stirred anxieties he had not anticipated. Yet he had shown up for every meeting, every training session, every difficult conversation about his past and his capability. The Foundation's teams did not ask him to be flawless, only honest, and that honesty became the fragile thread he held onto as he stepped into a new kind of responsibility. Today was the center's soft opening phase, not yet for the public, but for the staff and partners who would shape its earliest days. Michael felt the weight of the building's silence as he walked through the entrance. Inside, rooms that had once echoed with emptiness now carried murmurs of preparation. Volunteers moved tables. A small group of medical professionals reviewed protocols. A coordinator from a local shelter tested a digital kiosk. They greeted Michael respectfully, aware of his role, but not overly focused on it, treating him as someone working alongside them rather than above them. He preferred it that way. Ranger stayed close, projecting the calm steadiness that had grounded him through every training course the Foundation arranged. Even now, the dog's instincts monitored his breathing, catching the moments when tension rose too quickly. Standing in the main hall, Michael felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. He did not imagine himself as a leader, yet the work around him existed partly because he had been willing to accept a truth he once tried to bury, that service did not end when the uniform came off, and that surviving hardship gave him a language many people in this building desperately needed someone to speak. A volunteer named Rosa, a woman who once struggled through her own history of domestic upheaval, approached him with a clipboard. She explained that she had joined the center's programming team because she wanted to help other women who had nowhere to go. She thanked him briefly, not for what he had done, but for agreeing to be visible in this role. Her gratitude struck him gently because it came from a place that recognized vulnerability rather than elevating him. When she left, he turned to Ranger, who watched her exit with quiet understanding, sensing the emotional exchange even without words. The meeting with the Foundation's director later that morning carried none of the pressure he had expected. The director reviewed the blueprint of the final staffing structure, then asked Michael how he felt stepping into the role. The question seemed simple but carried a depth that nudged at the truths he had been wrestling with. He admitted that some days he doubted his capacity, that the ghosts of past missions still followed him, that leading people felt heavier than following orders ever had. The director listened fully, then reminded him that leadership rooted in humility tended to last longer than leadership rooted in certainty. Michael carried that thought with him as he walked the corridors again. He passed the counseling wing, where a licensed therapist, a former military spouse who had lost her partner in service, prepared her office. She greeted him with a nod, then returned to arranging materials for the trauma recovery groups she would soon lead. Her presence reminded him that healing did not happen in isolation, and that the center was designed not just to rehabilitate, but to reconnect the people who had slipped too far from themselves. Later, while adjusting signage near the entrance, Michael saw the elderly couple from the storm walking toward the building. He had not expected to see them here today. Their movements were steady, their expressions composed, but there was a warmth in their eyes that had not been present during that cold morning in his taxi. The Foundation coordinator introduced them formally this time, explaining that they were among the major private partners supporting the project. Their earlier pretense had meant to evaluate him, but their presence now felt different, grounded not in assessment, but in shared investment. They approached him with quiet sincerity. The man thanked Michael for how he had treated them that morning, not because of the test, but because kindness given freely revealed the kind of leader the community needed. The woman added softly that dignity, once offered in hardship, could ripple farther than the giver ever knew. Their words pressed against memories that felt fragile to hold. Ranger stepped closer, responding to the emotional swell that threatened to unbalance him. He placed a hand on the dog's head, steadying himself before responding with gratitude he struggled to articulate. As the day progressed, Michael oversaw small tasks that felt larger than they looked, approving a layout change in the training room, listening to a veteran volunteer who worried about returning to a collaborative workspace after years of isolation, encouraging a young intern uncertain about her role. In each conversation, Michael sensed echoes of his own doubts, and speaking to them helped stabilize something inside him. In the late afternoon, the Foundation's small internal gathering commenced. Staff and contributors formed a loose circle in the main hall as the director detailed the purpose of the center and the collaborative nature of its creation. When Michael was invited to speak, he hesitated, feeling the room tilt under the weight of old reflexes that feared scrutiny. But Ranger moved closer, a subtle, grounding presence, and Michael found his breath again. He spoke simply. He spoke of service, of fear, of choosing to show up even when he doubted himself. He spoke of the people he had met while driving the taxi and how their quiet resilience had kept him moving through his own darkest days. He ended by saying that the center existed not because of him alone, but because people believed that healing was possible when a community refused to give up on its own. The room did not erupt into applause. Instead, there was a stillness that carried more meaning than noise. A quiet acknowledgement that every person in the room was part of something larger than themselves. As the gathering concluded, Michael stepped outside into the cooling evening. The building glowed gently behind him, not with grandeur, but with promise. Ranger sat beside him, calm, alert, the embodiment of a loyalty that had followed him through every shift in his life. For a long moment Michael watched the entrance, imagining the people who would walk through those doors in the weeks ahead. Veterans seeking support, families searching for stability, young people looking for a place to begin again. He did not know if he could guide all of them. He did not know if he would stumble. But he knew he would show up. That was the piece of himself he had learned to trust, the one instinct that had survived everything. He took a slow breath and felt, for the first time in years, a sense of completion settling into the spaces where fear once lived. The center was ready. He was ready. And the city, in its quiet way, felt ready too. There are moments in life when the world feels too heavy for one pair of hands, when the road bends in ways we do not understand, and when the silence inside our own hearts becomes louder than the streets around us. Yet it is often in those quiet, uncertain places that God places the smallest seeds of grace. Michael thought he was simply surviving another day, driving another mile, giving one more act of kindness that no one would ever see. But sometimes God watches the smallest choices, the ones shaped not by strength but by compassion, and turns them into miracles far greater than the giver could imagine. The new center did not begin with money or architects or grand plans. It began with a weary veteran opening his heart when he had nothing left to spare. And maybe that is God's way of reminding us that blessings often enter through the doors we open for others. In our everyday lives, kindness still matters. A warm word can lift someone who is drowning in silence. A simple gesture can become the turning point in a stranger's story. And a small act of generosity, offered without expectation, can ripple outward until it touches lives we will never meet. So as you close this story, may you carry with you the truth at its heart. God still moves quietly through human hands. He still works through broken people who dare to love in a difficult world. And He still turns simple acts of goodness into the miracles we didn't know we were waiting for. If this story touched you, please share it so its light can reach someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us how God has shown up in your own life, even in small ways. And remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the quiet miracles that still walk among us. May God bless you and protect every heart watching today. May His grace follow you, guide you, and remind you that no act of kindness is ever wasted in His eyes. Amen.